I feel like the hair thickness it's necessitated me using comb. I could usually, frankly, style it just with my hands with how thin it was. But the individual strands, I feel like, are thicker. There's better coverage overall. So I don't think there's quote unquote hair regrowth in terms of, a ton of new, hairs popping out or otherwise. It's not like my hairline has come forward or come back. But I do think that the overall thickness has likely increased there and giving me greater coverage for the hair to build on itself. That's probably 80% of what's cosmetically different and noticeable. And friends, family members have said to me, independently without me saying anything, hey, your hair, it's thicker, it's still the same style, and otherwise, like, what's going on? And I'm not getting into all this with.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the HairStacks podcast. And today we have a returning guest. I'm sure you guys remember him, John. And today we're going to be looking at just, some of the comments and just some additional updates. But for those of you who may not remember, I'm going to ask John if he could maybe reintroduce himself.
Yeah, hey everybody. Again, John, that's my assumed name from the previous podcast I appeared on. Guy in his early 50s, been fighting hair loss for that period of time. Was probably one of the first, if not the first, documented case, me, other guy online on hair loss help that had started using RU 588-8841 in the early 2000s, around 2001. And had my experience with that documented, and a number of questions came up that Kyle and I had tried to answer for some folks online, but a little hard to give some detail, nuance, and description with regards to things. So figured we'd hop back on and have a little follow-up chat.
Most definitely. We can start off with synchronized shedding and RU58841, if that was something that you ever noticed.
Yeah, I can't say that it was from my experience. Again, I know people have commented on the idea of shaving my head, and that was just what was on my mind. So as far as seeing how much hair was falling out when I had it, I didn't start applying RU until that point, where I had my head shaved, or as a part of things, and I didn't really notice anything as I was slowly growing it back in over that period of time, where all of a sudden things drastically changed as I tried to do so for that. I think it was 4, 5, 6+ month period of time that I extended, using RU for that period of time. So no synchronized shedding. And I think the only time that I was experienced shedding was, kind of leading up to the point where I worked with the hair loss clinic here locally, and was still seeing a lot of that, and at the point where we I started working with that group, and I was onto 5% minoxidil with some tretinoin, kind of premixed in there. Did I notice that shedding stop? So I feel like that issue was probably addressed before then.
Yeah, I guess this is just my opinion here as well. When it comes to the synchronized shedding thing, it seems to me that that's only a documented thing when it comes to 5-alpha reductase inhibitors, particularly finasteride. So, I mean, I can understand why people would ask that question. I guess it's worth knowing. So, I guess the next point that some people made was something along the lines of you having more hair in your 50s than you did in your earlier years. So what's like your take on that? Would you say that tends to be true? It does look like when you had a similar hairstyle, photos from the 50s, from your 50s, right? The hair seems like thicker in quality than when you were like, I guess, in your late 20s.
Yeah, I do think so, and I think it probably requires some clarification, because I think for some folks they would look at it and say, "Oh, great, just Dutasteride. That's what the guy stayed on. He used RU for a given period of time. Was there anything, in recent history about my stack that changed?" And certainly things did. Whether or not that would ultimately, it wasn't really intentional, such that I thought anything would have a dramatic impact. But a couple of things are really, I think, worth noting and detailing. And that's some of what I think I'd sent along for you. The biggest thing you and I were talking about before we hopped on here a little bit is just thinking about your videos with regards to tretinoin and the sulfotransferase enzyme and how I had again originally used it. It was pre-mixed. Tretinoin was with a 5% minoxidil. And when you think about aging and the ability for your hair, maybe for the scalp and hair follicle to still produce that enzyme at the same amount, maybe when I was in my 20s, what would make more sense in terms of using tretinoin? And I would say I kind of waxed and waned with how much I was integrating that, into my treatment over a given period of time. And just, kind of thinking through utilizing it, I was no longer pre-mixing it. And I said to myself, well, I've got this supply of tretinoin 0.05% cream. If this enzyme is in the outer root sheath of, probably more active hair follicles, maybe it would make sense to go ahead and apply that across my entire scalp, where the hairs are more likely to be able to kind of, upregulate that enzyme to a certain extent. And then, put a little more emphasis into subsequently, applying the minoxidil and make that a regular part of my routine. And that is something, 3 times a week that I really emphasize. And, just because tretinoin and a lot of that, that class of drug is just really sensitive to being broken down, whether that's with light, whether that's with handling, heat, it's really subject to things being problematic. So pre-mixing it, um, could be the sort of thing that if it's sitting around in a lotion bottle for, I don't know, a few weeks, if it's not protected, it might break down and not have the maximum benefit. So that was something that I feel like, potentially has played, a role. As I look at, the photos that I was sending you, I became more and more confident that that might have been something over the last year that I emphasized that was helpful. I mean, maybe you want to delve into and talk a little bit about what we were before we hopped on here with regards to tretinoin and kind of some of your experience, but that's kind of some of my gut feeling with regards to that. And then I can talk about maybe some of the other things that I think might have really helped to amplify that effect.
Oh yeah, most definitely. And I think before we started recording, we were talking about getting that sulforotransferase enzymatic activity up, and also maybe not relying solely on tretinoin, right? Because just looking at what happens when you apply minoxidil and you get that prodrug minoxidil sulfate from various studies, and I'm sure many people in the audience know this already, but I can mention some now and I can also put some in the description. But we need minoxidil sulfate to grow hair. It's not, just, oh, the minoxidil is growing hair. There are studies that show that the minoxidil stimulates a different part of the hair follicle. I think it's the outer root sheath cells, and minoxidil sulfate stimulates the human keratinocyte cells. And this was in a paper, I believe the title, just to my memory, was somewhere along the lines of, quote, growth effects of minoxidil and minoxidil sulfate on cultured human keratinocytes and outer root sheath cells, unquote, by Hyul Chun Yoon, and I think it's from the National University of Medicine. Sorry, the National University College of Medicine of South Korea. So I'll be showing that on the screen, or again putting that in the description depending on how the media is presented. But yeah, this was, I think, published sometime in 1992, so we've known quite a while where minoxidil is doing the job and how minoxidil sulfate is the most relevant part in the hair growth process. We also have other studies. There was this one study by Asim Sharma and Dr. Trueb, and it showed that in people that were previously unresponsive to minoxidil, that when they used 0.1% topical tretinoin in conjunction with topical minoxidil, I think it was like 5%, that a lot of them were turned into responders, or they had a notable uptick in sulforotransferase activity in the hair follicle. There was also another study titled, I think it's something like minoxidil sulforotransferase, a marker of human keratinocyte differentiation, unquote, something like that, by Gerald A. Johnson et al. In 1992, and it was for the Upjohn Company, and it was here that it was established that minoxidil sulfate was the driver of hair growth, not minoxidil. So you needed minoxidil to transform into minoxidil sulfate, and that minoxidil sulfate was the deciding factor of whether or not someone would grow hair. So there was a question in my mind. I thought, okay, why not go for applying topical minoxidil sulfate? This would be relevant if people didn't have the necessary sulforotransferase enzymatic activity in regards to whether or not they'd grow hair, right? So if you apply minoxidil sulfate to the scalp, maybe everyone could theoretically become responders. So the bottleneck that is the sulforotransferase enzymatic activity wouldn't really be an issue. But then you look at the literature and you see things like minoxidil sulfate not being stable in aqueous solutions, and I think that was the primary pain point as to why we, don't have minoxidil sulfate readily available on the market. However, there are other, papers, some conducted by Dr. Trueb, that showed the efficacy of minoxidil sulfate if it's distilled in some sort of lipid carrier. So if it's put into, I think the oil that they used in his paper was North American witch hazel. And because it's not an aqueous solution, it's more, fat and lipid base, it's not going to break down. And also it seems to have a stable pH, which would prevent it from, being the minoxidil sulfate, from degrading. So that's a good one. And then you have what they do in Brazil. I have a subscriber of mine, and they get liposomal minoxidil sulfate. So they get the minoxidil sulfate put into a liposomal structure, and this prevents it from degrading when it is in a sort of aqueous solution. So there's different ways in which minoxidil sulfate could be delivered in a stable way to the human hair follicle. And if it's done adequately enough, it wouldn't matter whether or not you have the necessary sulforotransferase enzymatic activity, because you're already getting that sulfation of minoxidil, that minoxidil sulfate, the prodrug that we know is responsible for hair growth in humans. And again, from my understanding, I think it's popular in the country of Italy, because in Italy they have a long tradition of compounding medications. It's also available in Switzerland, as well as, again, like I said earlier, Brazil. But really in the United States, it looks like there's not an adequate supply chain that exists to necessitate the creation of minoxidil sulfate. I think there's like one company right here in the state of New Jersey where I am that produces minoxidil sulfate. I think they're called Spectrum. And outside of that, no other company is really, producing minoxidil sulfate in mass. So when it comes to the sort of, I guess, consumer end, there's a huge limitation on getting this thing compounded, along with just in general having it marketed, right? Like people immediately go for the minoxidil, the regular minoxidil, but it's not really a question, or maybe they're just not aware. I would bet they're mostly not aware of the benefits of a sort of stable delivery of minoxidil sulfate to the human hair follicle. So all of that is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. That, you know, kind of just targeting where it could have the maximum impact. There's some degree of diffusion that's a global effect from applying minoxidil. I'm not entirely convinced that you have to hit every hair follicle directly as you're applying it. There's going to be some level of diffusion over the 23 hours that I think minoxidil stays active on the scalp. So if you're kind of priming the pump and kind of preparing the skin accordingly for once the minoxidil comes through to be converted as easily as possible, and finding really what's the most optimal tolerable retinoid that you can utilize there. And that was one of the things when I was thinking about utilizing it. Again, I don't use the derma roller a ton separately, but just thinking about applying the tretinoin, there might be once a week where I actually integrate that just to really make sure that it's getting in. So I do feel like that was something that was potentially helpful as well. I mean, some of the other adjunctive things that have been a part of my health routine probably less so. Um, but yeah, I think that in particular, I think I have come across some resources that have talked about adapalene, being another form of retinoid, that could potentially, target the hair follicle. But I just haven't seen it being studied in this capacity, and I'm just really fascinated by it because it is, it seems like such a crucial step and component to this overall.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of question if these topical vitamin A derivatives, adapalene, tretinoin, how exactly is it boosting sulforotransferase? Is it boosting it simply due to increasing the cell turnover rate, or is there some sort of other mechanism of action at play here? Um, at least from what I know from adapalene, it seems to be less photosensitive than tretinoin, but also it seems to be more potent when it comes to interacting with the retinoid receptor in the in certain tissues. So, I would assume it would be just as effective, but like you said, there's just not that many studies regarding adapalene.
See, I'm fascinated by it as a part of things. I'm looking for more resources, but it's quite possible that it's such a niche topic that it just hasn't been covered, at the level of detail that you and I would be interested in. Uh, but there is, a lot of positive things about, retinoids and their benefits that I've come across. So it's going to continue to really be a part of my stack. I think one of, to answer the question, a bit further about what my current stack is, or, what that looks like. I think in the document, it's got all the other basic things that we covered. I mean, there's nothing dramatic that's in here, with regards to, shampoo, or, Avodart dose has been all standard and so forth. But one of the things, and you've been covering it quite a bit recently, is the whole notion of peptides and what impact that might have. There's so many of them that are out there. I started investigating it, for myself, and went under a doctor's care to do a few different cycles. And some of the ones that you've covered as a part of things, I was really getting into utilizing them for the intention and purpose of body recomposition. I'd lost some weight, 50 plus here. I wanted to, still be able to put on some muscle and really focus on that. And, had investigated and come across the BPC 157 as well as CJC 1295 ipamorelin. Again, these are, compounds that, you know, some people have purported online as being beneficial potentially for hair. I know I've seen some people trying to utilize them and so forth. The way in which, I really went about them was, again, not with the intention for hair. But, looking at the photos over the last year, notwithstanding the change, the trying to get utilized tretinoin as a part of things, maybe it's been synergistic for me. So I've done 3 8-week cycles, 2 months on, 2 months off, where I was using BPC 157, at a fairly intermediate dose. I'm not going to bother to get into the dosing or make recommendations around that. Talk to your doctor, that sort of thing. But incorporating, CJC 1295 ipamorelin, which are really designed, to upregulate the production and the release of human growth hormone, which ultimately in the body gets converted into insulin-like growth factor. And in terms of how it's purported, it doesn't grow muscle independently in and of itself. It's basically, the way peptides work is it's only going to work on tissues that you're actively engaging.
Yeah.
And so, when you think about injuries, um, think he is the physician that I followed some of his talks online, and I'll send you along the links. It's William Seeds. He's founding um, physician of Seed Scientific Research and Performance, and he's done a couple of really interesting podcasts where he talks about BPC, upregulating. I think he described it in one podcast as the human growth hormone receptor on certain tissues. Again, he didn't specify tissue. There's only so much, I think there's a lot lacking in terms of the research as to where that would be taking place in the body. But BPC, it's really it can be taken in orally, it can be injected. It's not something that can pass through, the tissue, but it's injected into the skin, and then if you have an injury, the body is smart. These compounds go into the body, and if there's inflammation, it's trying to create greater vascularity
Yeah.
within that area. So for myself, yes, using it for workouts, pre or post workout doesn't really matter. But if I was injecting it in the morning and utilizing that, and I knew that it was in my system, well, that was probably, one of the days where I was going to use the derma roller, because
Ooh, good
I'm
point.
just thinking about it, like the derma roller in and of itself. Again, not a lot of, information there. That it's fantastic, but if I'm basically signaling to the body, hey, there's a problem over here. There's tissue injury, or not really injury. I'm not, pressing it. I'm not getting, any kind of, deep redness or bleeding in that area. But I'm telling the body, hey, pay attention to me over here. There's a potential wound being created. Well, BPC is probably going to wind up in that neighborhood. And if I'm upregulating IGF receptors, to me, as I look at my hair, as I look at, the photos, again, I've got a pretty good history going back, even just family photos and otherwise over the last 3, 4, 5 years. These photos more so now than ever, the hair is thicker. And if I put, I'm at the point now where, I feel like the hair thickness it's necessitated me using comb. I could usually, frankly, style it just with my hands with how thin it was. But the individual strands, I feel like, are thicker. There's better coverage overall. So I don't think there's quote unquote hair regrowth in terms of, a ton of new, hairs popping out or otherwise. It's not like my hairline has come forward or come back. But I do think that the overall thickness has likely increased there and giving me greater coverage for the hair to build on itself. That's probably 80% of what's cosmetically different and noticeable. And friends, family members have said to me, independently without me saying anything, hey, your hair, it's thicker. It's still the same style and otherwise, like, what's going on? And I'm not getting into all this with them and kind of explaining, the nuances of what this routine looks like. But to me, these two factors likely, yes, I have more hair in my 50s, and in particular over the last year, and I would rate these things at the top. I think we answered one fellow's question online with regards to anything else I've done over the last year. And yeah, I've used some NMN, which is a NAD booster. I've been real regular with infrared sauna, PBM, red light therapy, but those are kind of secondary things that are very, very fringe. And there is, I mean, I think Peter Attia, Dr. Attia was on the Uberman podcast and talking about, the skin does lose NAD, upwards of 60% in a lifetime, he talked about. And there is some, limited studies talking about reduced incidence of squamous and basal cell carcinoma, reduced incidence with use of NR or NMN. So it is something that's been in my routine, but again, there's absolutely nothing about hair growth that's out there, with regards to that. So take that with a grain of salt, but it's probably an area that people are gonna be looking at, um, in short order, to see whether or not it has impact in that way. But there's a lot of people in the longevity community that have looked at that, but it doesn't have the kind of drastic effect or impact. I'm not in that camp with regards to, what people are hyping it around and being, and whether or not that even stays part of my stack. But I'm definitely of the mindset that infrared sauna is helpful, general health benefit on blood pressure and otherwise, cellular turnover, that sort of thing, is that if you're trying to encourage that process, and red light therapy, you know, anything that enhances or helps with mitochondria and, reducing reactive oxygen species is generally helpful. I think my skin, has really held up pretty well, um, overall in terms of its quality. Yes, I've had to start some Botox, um, in the last couple of months, but that's not anything related to hair loss. That's, just related to fine lines, wrinkles, and that sort of thing.
That was super, super detailed, and I actually really thank you for just kind of going through, just answering everyone's questions when it came to any stack updates. I think people are going to really appreciate that. The point you made about microneedling and using BPC 157 to potentially, if it does have that effect, to try to contribute to the healing process. That was a really interesting point, at least from what I've seen from a lot of these peptides, BPC 157, TB 500. They all seem to have some sort of anti-inflammatory effect, or it seems to mitigate the inflammatory response from whether it's an injury or maybe some other cause that occurs in the skin. And I'm under the same opinion where I do think there needs to be some more research into these particular peptides, especially when it comes to their delivery mechanisms as well. Because it's kind of a shame that we don't get that data, right? So
Absolutely. I think that they're fascinating and they're likely compounds. I think in your video today you were talking about TB 500 and its potential role in being rolled into something that would work nicely, at the donor or recipient site as a component to things. I can tell you that, without question, if I was to get a hair transplant, if I wanted to just try and get my hairline rebuilt, I would be on VPC and I would consider TB500 injectable, and let the body, utilize that component, um, because it needs a signal, for it to be taken up, and that's two ways of looking at it. Even if it could be delivered dermally, it needs a reason to do what it needs to do. And so is there something about needling or injection or otherwise that, kind of prompts that turnover process, to go on? I think there's something to be said there. But I would, I would be quite curious, in addition to your mentioning verteporfin, how that would come together in terms of reducing scarring and really ultimately getting the most optimal and maximized result, for someone, that was undergoing that type or style of procedure. It really, you know, um, it really makes sense to me on a number of levels. I think, peptides are, under some degree of FDA review as to whether or not they're going to continue to be able to be prescribed. I think, you know, um, a lot of the attention and utilization that's gone on, has caught the FDA's eye. So we'll see, how that plays out in the months and years to come. But the GLP-1, medications have really brought this sort of thing back into focus. And, if somebody finds something where there's less side effects and this can be helpful to someone, maybe, some of that success will bring people back, hopefully in this direction.
I certainly agree. There's one more thing about the peptides that I wanted to talk about. I remember in our last, it was our last interview that we did, two companies that were brought up, Follicum and Amplifica, and what may be going on with their particular hair growth stimulants that they're working on independently. To my knowledge, it seems like they're both playing on trying to make a derivative of OPN, osteopatin. At least from what I've seen on Follicum's website, they've dramatically changed everything. It's actually kind of interesting. Initially, it appeared as if their phase two, I think, one of their phases just failed to show any sort of efficacy, and then it looks like they're going the cosmeceutical route of things. I'm not particularly sure what's going on there in terms of what they're trying to make with their FOL005, but they made a lot of weird claims on their media promotion for that particular peptide. And I thought, it just coming to my head right now, I thought it'd be just interesting to bring up and get your opinion about it. I'm actively actually looking at their website right now, but it looks like they changed the entire website completely. Follicum.com is no longer a thing. It just redirects you to another pharmacy. But essentially, they said something along the lines of oral pyrolutamide being safer than oral finasteride, and then them saying FOL005 had no side effects and it was safe for all. And they were doing this weird thing where they would compare finasteride results at 6 months or something like that, 7 months, compared to Follicum at 8 months, and then Minoxidil at like 6 months. To me, it was really strange what they were exactly trying to get across about their compound with just such a short time frame of observational data that they claim to have. Another thing here that I wanted to point out, I had to use the Wayback Machine in order to find some of their deleted articles, again, because they updated their website. They had new things posted on their website. And I found one of their press reports from, I think it was May of 2021, right? And in the article, this press report, essentially, they came out saying that FOL005 was not statistically significant when it came to growing hair, meaning it doesn't seem to have any sort of efficacy for combating androgenetic alopecia or being some sort of hair growth stimulant. And this was discovered in their Phase IIa. So I guess it makes sense why they're going to the cosmetic route, because I guess they want to get it to the market. But their CEO said, hey, we're disappointed. It didn't seem to work, but we still believe in, our treatment, and we think that, the ethos of using these glycoproteins could somehow restore hair follicles. So maybe they had a low concentration of FOL005, or maybe it just doesn't work. But, it's very strange to me that they updated the entire website. They got rid of the BS sort of claims that they made, and also they got rid of their initial press report statements about the actual clinical trials that they did. It's kind of odd.
Yeah, there was a lot of sleight of hand that was going on in that presentation. That was more, to me, it looked like, just like pumping themselves up, like they had something where it wasn't an apples to apples, comparison. I mean, I just think we would have heard more with regards to it. I thought that I had seen on the Hair Loss Cure 2020 website that maybe the company had come into an agreement with another group to look at other peptides and move in that direction. Yeah, I mean, I might have to try and forward this along to you. Yeah, there's a whole link here that I'll send along. I have to read into it in a little bit more
Yeah.
detail, but yeah, they're they're switching things up. I don't think that they see the market, despite their efforts around going. It could wind up being a cosmeceutical, but it's when I think you and I shared and talked about what Amplifica is up to, and
Yeah.
the incredible detail that Dr. Plakas is really looked at things. I think you and I spent some time looking over the patent. That's and what's incorporated there, and it's right down to the size, the molecular weight, the entire. It's not just osteopontin, but there's some IGF compounds in there. There's other
Hyaluronic
forms of
acid.
binding proteins related to CD44, which is the receptor that osteopontin is targeting. And my assumption is that to really try and make that work, within the skin and make sure it gets exactly where they want it to. That is, at a whole different class and level. And I think that they've likely worked out, to a certain extent, at least in the lab, that it has got to be injected, at some level. And it'd be great if you could find a drug that had, a similar effect and impact. But you and I might have had a side email conversation about it. There was a really interesting dialogue that Dr. Huberman on the Huberman Lab podcast had with a Stanford professor talking about GLP-1s and their, just the discovery of GLP-1 and the attempt by a lot of the drug companies to try and create drugs that would, really bump that up. And, they just didn't meet with any success. The drugs didn't, because it didn't arrive at a physiological, or I think they were describing as a pharmaceutical dose that was really hyper-stimulatory and mimicking this GLP-1. And I think of these molecules in kind of the same class in the same way, because Dr. Rassman talked about, kind of handing, their Amplifica is running the trials as proof of concept, basically, but they need a drug company that's got more money and capability to bring it to market. Well,
Yeah.
let's say the formula of osteopon, what's in here it's great and it works, but more ideally, and again, I'm going to make up numbers. Maybe it's you do the injection and it's active within the skin for 3 hours. But it would be that much better if you had a version of the compound, a version of osteopontin that was injected that really, lasted in the skin several days and is hyper stimulatory. And, only at the point where a $1 billion, pharmaceutical company going after that to create that version of it, is it stimulatory enough to have the effect of, the lasting impact that won't keep you coming back every 6 months, maybe it's every 6 years. And it just really, as he describes it, kind of serving as a kicker, of getting the hair going into the, the anagen growth, the full terminal hair status. It might require, that, and what they're doing might wind up being proof of concept. It'd be wonderful if they had a home run with the formula, completely, right off the bat, and it just works, and somebody picks up and says, you know what, this is so good as is, we're going to run with a phase 3. Thank you so much. License it to us. You guys are going to get paid for this, and we're off and running. It's, perhaps possible that they've done that, but it might wind up being the sort of thing that you look at these compounds that, are in the patent. A lot of them are naturally occurring proteins. There's nothing in here that I can see that is synthesized with a unique chemical structure or fingerprint. So I'm not saying anybody could just copy it, but I am saying, companies like Shiseido that is, kind of coming out with their own product, potentially they could take, any one of these protein molecules and start incorporating that in their own concentrations that make sense, to improve upon what they're already doing if they feel like, hey, their in-house testing, works. Whereas something like, taking, what Dr. Plikus has come up with and come up with your own unique structure to it, well, that's a whole different level of patent if somebody's infringing on that, and not easily copied or replicated. And it might afford the company some degree of protection if they really have a home run with the product, and anybody can walk in and, you're turning hair from villus into terminal, and, you're really doing it. And then again, the same thing might be true with Scoob 3, if they wind up taking that down the line, is that there might be, a version of it that works a little bit better or a little bit more ideally, because these proteins, they're bigger than peptides.
Yeah.
They are particularly sensitive, even more so, which is why they have to be, injectable to be long lasting, to be stable, and work in that fashion. I think that's perhaps where all of this is heading, unless somebody knows more than me on it.
No, I would definitely agree with you. Um, at least from looking at the patent, it seems like they're maybe I could be mistaken here, but they're going for the exact method, like their exact protocol of administering osteopatin and along with these other glycoaminoglycans, like I guess hyaluronic acid as well. They have this exact methodology that they're trying to patent. I don't know too much about patent law when it comes to what other companies would be able to replicate, but I think if they were to make a true, let's say, derivative of osteopatin in their lab, they would definitely own that. That would be something that they created in house. But it definitely, at least in my perspective, if they're successful, it could set off some sort of arms race where other companies are starting to now look into this particular space of hair growth stimulants, these peptides, and they could possibly create something that's more effective or that's comparable, right? Just giving consumers more options, and it could be, something could come out of that that's just very effective.
I can absolutely see that happening. I would think that a lot of these companies like Shiseido or otherwise are looking at the basic and fundamental research and saying, "Hey, what do we have that already, you know, works on this, and can we come up with our own version and formula, for this? Or is there somebody else that they want to partner with, to take that up to the next level?" I think, just like we saw with GLP-1, once it caught fire, hey, it really, everybody's into the peptide, business, with things. With this sort of thing as well, it just might make more sense, if you get the proof of concept, and, ultimately, I hope, those results come out. I hope that they're positive. Um, I just think that, to have this kind of effect, individual drugs are fantastic, like, the 5 alpha reductase inhibitors at doing what they're doing, but having kind of this, really stronger stimulant, needs something that's maybe of the more physiologic versus the pharmacologic variety, and works within kind of the natural mechanisms for the body, and that's really what it seems like they're after. But I agree with you. It could set off quite the arms race in terms of, who can get something to market, based on just the fundamental science.
And just about, I guess, arms racing, and I guess hair loss drugs. Kintor Pharmaceuticals and their pyrolutamide topical anti-androgen. Yeah, I guess you more or less saw that occurring as well, right? Them racing against Cassiopeia to try to get some sort of product. Cassiopeia being the Cosma Pharmaceuticals, being the creator of Coscotrone, Winlivy, or CB0301. That's currently being trialed as Breezula. So there was this sort of like competition between the two to see who could get this sort of topical anti-androgen to treat androgenetic alopecia onto the market first. And at least to me, like when you have these sort of competitions, you start to see just the desperation from some of these companies and them trying to get something to market. Because as we know, with KX826 pyrolutamide, it failed Phase 3, but now it's on market as a cosmeceutical. I mean, I guess for some people, they're kind of like they're a bit distressed by hearing news like that when something becomes a cosmeceutical. Do you think when pharmaceutical companies adopt the cosmeceutical path, does that kind of discourage you from using that particular product? Do you doubt its overall efficacy, or do you think maybe there's still something to it that that particular product could be beneficial in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, it was interesting. I was listening to Huberman Lab podcast that just came out yesterday, and the doctor that was on there, he was covering Tretinoin and a lot of things that were interested in the neighborhood. I mean, the guy kind of shot himself in the foot. I'm waiting for Kevin's response because blood flow came up.
Uh-oh.
You know how that look out. You know how that's going to go over. It was a very brief point, and maybe they just kind of brushed over it. But I'm listening to this guy. I'm like, you're Stanford educated, and you're talking about blood flow and minoxidil. I'm like, again, it was a passing point. And I'm like, oh. But he was covering. This physician was talking about, just things that are not pharmaceutical grade, and that they really don't rise up to the level of doing very much in terms of skincare. That was his general across the board statement. All of these quote unquote, and you'll see it a lot within skincare actives, whether that's niacinamide or vitamin C or otherwise, they just don't have enough. And he was really, hyping up Tretinoin. If I watched most of it. So I do kind of lose a degree of faith from a not well established realm of science. At the same time, I have used Adapalene, as a part of that, and I not so much for my hair, although I'm looking to probably start integrating that into things as opposed to Tretinoin. But that the science is established within that given realm or class of drugs, and so who's producing it. That there's a pharmaceutical grade and there's an over-the-counter grade. So it definitely gives me a bit of pause. I mean, frankly, coming forward, and even you and I doing the original interview, I was like, well, I was following your other videos, and I said to myself, well, pyrolutamide coming out, these other drugs. This RU58841 story from 20 plus years ago is going to be a footnote. Now I'm saying to myself, pyrolutamide, people have lost all faith in that. They probably have more faith in RU despite the dangers you and I have talked about, just because you have so much more, so many more people. And the one fellow that, you interviewed, more recently, he talked, a lot about having it as part of his stack, and he had quite the success story with regards to things of turning his hair and his look and so forth around. Kudos to him. At the same time, that's the sort of thing people will put more faith in anecdotal stories like that than how they basically Kintor is bungling pyrolutamide, and not getting it over the finish line to have that degree of authenticity, to it. And again, it's, so again, you know, so maybe my story is a little bit more relevant in the grand context than I would have thought it would have been. But you can see where anecdotes and people looking at that, they're going to make decisions based on, their exposure to, to the information. It would have been really nice had they taken it, and even if it was just a great stabilizer, fantastic. That's probably what it's good for, unless you're catching it really, really early on,
Exactly.
as a part of things. It just, it would be better. It'll be interesting to see where, what is it, Clascaterone and Winlevi, it looks like that was, coming forward. Maybe that'll be the one that, that gets the pharmaceutical approval and that use indication where it has to be prescription, and people have a lot more faith in that, and that'll supplant, all the efforts from Kintor, again, because they're building up a track record based on acne, for their medication.
I was gonna say, like, even if KX826 flopped when it came to androgenetic alopecia, again, I'm pretty sure they're still doing testing when it comes to KX826 and acne, right? And if you look at the whole thing regarding, the thing that they brought to market with Coshine 826 being pyrolutamide, KX826, whatever, they mention in their headline, like, oh, and it can reduce oil production as well. And it's like, I honestly think they would have had a better run had they just come out with it being an acne treatment, I'm going to be honest, and it just being a treatment for AGA. Because to me, as somebody who's read the studies, they're saying that it's super effective on their website. But then in their phase 3, it didn't seem to reach that point of efficacy. And You could make the argument that it's a stabilizer as well, yeah. Um, but I think there's just so many things that Kintor missed on effectively maybe quote unquote promoting pyrilutamide, but also I would say, and maybe I'm speaking some big game here, but actually researching pyrilutamide as well. I think the concentration they started out with was way too low, 0.5%. I think they were trying to be a bit conservative when it came to the side effect side of things, because the whole part of their advertising campaign, or at least their promotional content in their presentations, is that finasteride bad, finasteride causes all these horrible things, and we're going to be the alternative to that. But in doing so, let's be real, you're a drug that's supposed to interact with the androgen receptor. Who's to say that, you can't also have any sort of sexual side effects or other side effects that people attribute to finasteride? Rather than them taking the position that, hey, our drug works well with finasteride and other 5-alpha reductase inhibitors. In fact, it could even, make you stabilize even better. They took the antithetical approach where they became combative, stating that our drug is possibly even better than finasteride, but in reality, it kind of just fell flat on its face. So I'm hoping with their 1% concentration test that they're doing right now that it has some sort of efficacy. And if it does, I think that's phenomenal for them because they already have it approved to be used as a cosmetic. So the only thing that's holding them back is either maybe they would have to go through the means of making that 1% or 2%, whatever concentration, being the prescribed concentration, the prescribed drug, and then whatever's on the market is the 0.5% concentration that has some sort of effect, whether it's for stabilizing or at the very least reducing oil secretions from the glands.
Yeah, it makes total sense to me. Again, you've got to have a strategy in terms of how you deploy this sort of thing. And acne is a huge market as well, and going after that and having a two-tiered structure makes a lot of sense. And maybe they'll rescue this from the verge of you know internet scorn, and come up with something at a proper concentration that makes sense. I mean, it would be great to have the product. Me, I'm stunned something hasn't been done sooner, but it's great to see companies racing to really try and make this happen in one form or another.
And I would say they really shot themselves, in the foot when they I don't know what makes companies do this. They found a random picture from a hair transplant, I guess, doctor, and then they threw it on their Amazon listing, and they were like, "Oh, this is what happens when you use our product." And then they got called out for it. It seems as if, from my understanding, there was some sort of miscommunication between an advertising agency they hired, and I mean, I just don't know, what it was. It just looked really bad. And I also find it hard to believe that it was a miscommunication when they already have their own in-house photos. So I guess the easiest thing to do there would just be to give those photos that you took of your patients to that advertising agency, rather than having them scramble around on the internet and find something random. Because that just looked really bad, really, really bad. And now it's making people doubt if GT229 is even worth it, right? If a company can be perceived to be quote unquote manipulative when it comes to these particular things, um, it's a shame because the mechanism of action of GT229, it's very novel when it comes to treating hair loss. But now you have this sort of public skepticism. You really have to prove a lot in your in this. I think this upcoming phase 3 for GT.
Absolutely. It's disheartening that there could be that big of a misstep. I mean, the marketing, the rollout for something is usually so well managed, and there's, such a tight, pipeline. Sure, I could see, some marketing department or company just, or a secondary or tertiary seller on Amazon, just saying, oh, great, we're just gonna, throw this picture out here. But I mean, for that to happen at launch, and not for the company to say, look, we're gonna be the only seller, we're gonna control it through our own shop, and we're gonna control the entire presentation, and just leaving that to chance is just it's just bad business, bad practice. And again, hopefully, it's not a sign of of things not working, and that there is still some legitimacy, but definitely it'll have more of the screws put to it. And I think some of their talk at a certain point was with regards to integrating and working side by side with a minoxidil type product. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but
No, you're right.
to
Yeah.
me, if that was, boy, if somebody put that 0.5 or 1% in a minoxidil foam can, oh, but hey, that's not an extra step for me. And if it's legitimate, and it one chemical doesn't interfere with the other, fantastic. That would be the way that I would consider utilizing it. But they got to produce some studies around that. Maybe that makes more sense for the over the counter, non-prescription market, if you got it at the higher concentration for for use separately, whether that's for acne or for hair loss. That would be a beautiful integration, if they were working on that first and foremost, rather than just dropping it out there and letting everybody figure it out.
Yeah, that that was ridiculous. Um, I guess going back to maybe an earlier point regarding your stack, I just wanted to revisit this. I think some people were asking questions about the dutasteride dosage. I think that was a particular question because, as we know, with the Olson et al. 2006 study, I think it was showing between 5 milligram finasteride versus various dosages of dutasteride up to 2.5 milligram, that there's a variation in scalp DHT suppression. So some people use 2.5 milligram dutasteride because it has been found to reduce DHT on the scalp by 79% or 80%. And other people just stick with the 0.5% concentration 0.5% milligram usage of dutasteride, which has been shown to reduce scalp DHT concentrations by 50%. So I guess naturally people were curious if you were just taking the typical 0.5%, keep saying 0.5%, 0.5 milligram dutasteride dosage, or if you probably went higher at any point in time.
Yeah, I've always just gone with 0.5. I think the pharmacodynamics to me of it being 5 weeks, despite knowing about that study and seeing it over a given period of time, you know I think we covered some of it in the previous episode with regards to my dialogue and discussion with the late Brian Shelton on the hair loss help forums. And just he and I had just numerous battles. I was convinced at the time that getting type 1 blocked, of the 5 alpha reductase, because of the sebaceous gland being right there, and it really having a heavy concentration, that hey, this is, the DHT is going to diffuse from the sebaceous gland over the derma papilla. It's right there. This, we need to have that. And at the end of having done RU, and dutasteride Avodart was just coming out, I just was no longer convinced that I could probably get any bit more suppression. And that Brian's point with regards to 5 alpha reductase inhibitors, at least for me in my case where I was at, had probably maxed out with regards to things. It would have been not impossible, but costly, and probably prohibitive, because over the years it's only been, I'd have to look at the year that dutasteride went and became a generic, but it's still relatively expensive, and it hadn't been that easy to come by unless I was going to use the overseas market again, which again I'd gotten away from. So I'd always stuck with the 0.5 just based on, Brian's, getting in my ear about that and just saying, look, you probably done what you could do. And, just the difficulty with regards to getting it. If they had a 2.5 milligram pill, I would take it, no problem, and I wouldn't really think twice about it. I do think that there's, something comes to mind, and I've thought about this over a period of time. When you think about BPH, you know, the prostate, it really takes off in terms of its growth and size later in life is the just my most basic fundamental understanding, and that's when it becomes problematic and symptomatic for many patients. So to me, is it possible that the enzyme, is getting upregulated later in life? And does it make sense,
Hmm.
you know, as I'm now in my 50s, if maybe the same thing holds true in hair, within the hair follicle for the hairs that are still there. Maybe that becomes dysregulated at a certain point, maybe it is, and maybe a higher dose makes sense, maybe using, Proscar in combination with Dutasteride, which I know you've covered as a part of things, just to have all your bases covered in terms of things. That has crossed my mind once or twice. Again, with my more recent success, feeling like, hey, over the last year, I've done well with, this, whole other protocol. Maybe there's something to it. But going forward to kind of hold ground on it, yeah, maybe it would be something I would consider. But 0.5 milligram has been what I've gone with, and it felt pretty good about. And I think one of the other thoughts, and I think we covered it previously, is that because I'm hypertensive, I am on 50 milligrams of spironolactone, which has some mild androgen receptor antagonist activity as well. And, so I feel like I'm kind of covered, to a certain extent above and beyond the standard user of dutasteride. But it's worthy of consideration, but not something I've done.
You mentioned something in the beginning of your response about the sebaceous glands, which, definitely caught my attention. I think it would make sense that the DHT that's produced by type 1 in the sebaceous glands easily could diffuse into the derm papilla, right? Um, but I guess another aspect that I've been exploring lately would be the process of lipid production in local tissues, right? From what we know, with specific conditions, specifically acne, and just seborrheic dermatitis as well, DHT likes to over excite the sebaceous glands to the point where they start producing sebum, and this sebum typically has very poor qualities, such as having high amounts of cholesterol and triglyceride. And this typically leads to things like I said before, acne and seborrheic dermatitis, where local microbes kind of feed on this sort of bad sebum, I guess you can put it, and it leads to an inflammatory response that is caused by your immune system trying to suppress these microbes. But also, there's some emerging evidence that in other hair loss conditions like lichen planopilaris, there is a defect of another receptor. It's the PPAR gamma receptor. This receptor is primarily responsible for lipid metabolism, and it seems like when this receptor's downregulated, it causes for there to be a buildup of lipids to the point where it becomes toxic in the tissue, and this triggers an immuno response such that you get lymphocytic infiltrate around specific tissues, and these tissue structures would be things like sebaceous glands, right, and sebocytes, where it seems as if the PPAR gamma receptors aren't adequately working, and this causes for the immune system to kind of attack the sebocytes and ultimately the sebaceous glands, leading to a scarring alopecia. So I just think DHT, at least in my opinion, from just looking at it being involved in other conditions that involves, poor lipid metabolism, it just seems to be a nuisance. But also, for me, it's like, okay, maybe there should be some more research into this space aside from it just being about androgenetic alopecia. Perhaps DHT's implications in other hair loss conditions, or its adjacent contributing factor to other hair loss issues, such that if it actually does have some sort of a role in, say, a lichen planopilaris manifesting, this is an autoimmune condition, right? It would be important to kind of, have more researchers look into that, because lichen planopilaris being an autoimmune condition, if you have one autoimmune condition, you're likely to be comorbid with another one from research that I've done before. I think there was an article from the Lancet that kind of reiterates on that. But I just wanted to get your thoughts about that, because when you mentioned the sebaceous glands and type 1,5-AR and DHT, that really brought that back to my memory.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's an excellent point, and I think you and I have, I touched on it in the previous interview, and I think and shared the link. I'll share it with you now. It's Dr. Proctor's site. Again, I use some of his products, but I think one of the lines within his write up talking about hair loss is just that under the microscope, the dermal papilla, the hair loss, it looks like organ rejection. And a lot of his the chemicals, the components that he tries to include as a part of things, is he tries to have a lot of nitric oxide mimetics. It's kind of, I think it would be called like a natural minoxidil. Again, he's a MD, PhD, pharmacologist, definitely knows his stuff, has a number of patents and so forth, so knows it well beyond what I do. But that's why a lot of his products, made sense with that regard. So to me, it falls in line, with that. And just thinking back to a couple other, things that we covered as a part of this, the fellow that was on the Uberman lab yesterday, he was talking a lot about the skin microbiome. And I think that they don't have a good handle on, because it's the biggest organ in the body, that component, and what might trigger certain conditions and what might contribute to things. It's beyond a degree of understanding that they're getting into. But I think you're touching on that makes a lot of sense to me. And to another point with regards to cellular health, and again, I would talk about, you know have people tune into at least some of the interviews I've come across with Dr. William Seeds, the fellow that was so involved in promoting BPC 157 and some of the the peptide therapy that I've utilized. He really emphasizes the health of the cell, and not just from a vascularization standpoint or otherwise, but that is in large part the area in the field that he works on. He's not looking at these compounds and just thinking about what they can do in terms of things, but how you can treat, an entire organ system or the entire body by just improving the health of the cell. And that would be helpful in terms of carryover, in terms of whether it's body recomposition, for myself that I was looking at these sort of things for, and potentially for hair growth. Maybe it just helps normalize some aspect of the natural turnover for skin cells, and for the skin, that is generally helpful for individuals, and therefore you get just better collagen, elastin production, mitochondria are more healthy. The body just gets back to doing what it could do 20 years ago in a more healthy state. And if you just do that, then forget about genetics or receptors or otherwise. You've helped the mitochondria do their cleanup job, do their turnover, in a more normalized process where there's not, as skin, is so subject to UV radiation and, genetic, breakdown, and as we know with cancers and so forth, but just a better turnover, more natural process. Maybe it helps to support things like the skin microbiome. Again, well beyond, my level of understanding for things, but I think it touches into that. It starts to get into that, how these compounds might have a role and might have been helpful for myself, but also, fundamentally addressing some of these things, because I've viewed his website. It's not exclusively orthopedics that he treats. There are autoimmune conditions. There are interviews that he's doing with patients that have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, MS. Again, heavily influenced, autoimmune rheumatologic conditions that he's probably trying to help people, from that standpoint, as opposed to just, hey, you need your joint replaced. You don't feel this well. You know, he's somebody that is big into exercise, and that hits home for me in terms of my understanding, and how that can be helpful, for individuals. Um, really, really makes sense on a number of levels. Maybe that's helped me in that regard, and that explains it, or maybe it's just dumb luck. Who knows?
No, I think that definitely answers the question. Yeah. Like my whole thing was, okay, if this thing is about lipid dysregulation and this particular receptor, which is responsible for regulating that sort of lipid environment in the tissue, if it's not working properly and it's leading to, again, this toxic buildup of lipids, and that is causing the immune system to freak out, target the sebaceous glands, destroy the sebaceous glands. By the way, you have the stem cell bulge that is over there that is responsible for growing, the hair. If that's gone, you get a scarring alopecia. Um, to me, it's like that kind of broadens my view on hair loss overall.
Yeah.
And it just being this sort of, I hate to say it, but it's kind of, a disease. And in many ways, it's you're seeing the destruction of an organ, essentially, of this hair follicle. But also it being potentially comorbid with other conditions, especially when we get into the lichen planopilaris literally being an autoimmune condition. Another thing that I thought was at least kind of disturbing to me was the reality that the of the bias in the literature when it comes to lichen planopilaris and other hair loss conditions, such that it states that it only affects postmenopausal women. And I was reading this one paper by the Mayo Clinic regarding lichen planopilaris, and it said something along the lines of, yeah, we excluded men from this study because we want to adequately assess if hormones impact lichen planopilaris, and or the manifestation of lichen planopilaris. And I was like, so it's clear that you're already coming with the assumption that this is a condition that can only affect not just, women, but specifically postmenopausal women. And now you're kind of missing out on a large chunk of the population that would otherwise, it could challenge your, your bias, right? And it also leads to there being a bias in biopsies, right? And I'll just, maybe this is, I'm not going to get too scientific with the studies here, but I'll just say, when a guy who's losing his hair goes to the doctor's most, especially if it presents in a NORAD pattern, you're just going to think it's androgenetic alopecia, right? If a lady comes into the doctor's office and says, "Hey doc, I'm losing my hair," it there's more concern there, because you typically don't associate women with hair loss, and if you do, you think something's really, really wrong. So you start running all these lab reports, and as well as using biopsies, right? So I think just with biopsies as well, there's this sort of bias that kind of hides the prevalence of certain conditions. And again, I have to harp on lichen planopilaris because when it comes to scarring alopecias, that is the scarring alopecia that it seems many people seem to face some sort of variant of it. In the one of the last podcasts that I did with Dr. Rassman, he actually mentioned that when I brought up conditions like dupa and retrograde alopecia, he mentioned a Dr. I think Shaver from Bernstein Medical. I think they're a hair transplant clinic, and they actually have gone the route of biopsying everyone that comes to their practice, or I think most people that come to their practice, to see if they have any other underlying conditions that would exclude them from being hair transplant candidates. And it's from what I remember Dr. Rassman saying, it seems like there's a lot of people that come back with a positive lichen planopilaris report, more than what the literature suggests, where it's, I think originally, it being 1 in 100,000, right? So it's just kind of concerning to me that, you mentioned, I think the doctor's name is Dr. Proctor, right? You mentioned how
Yeah.
he kind of says something along the lines of, when you look at the destruction of hair, and I guess these hair loss disorders, it looks like organ rejection, or is that something? I think that's something you said.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's I would say that kind of is true to an extent. When you look at these biopsies of lichen planopilaris, even in AGA, there's always like the lymphocytes are doing something. Like there's some mild fibrosis that occurs. Something's going on. Like there's some sort of interplay with the immune system attacking the hair follicle, and I think it makes sense. Eventually, even just looking at AGA proper, let's say a biopsy comes back and someone just only has AGA, yeah, the end stage of androgenetic alopecia, is there not any sort of alteration that happens to the dermopapilla cells such that they lose this thing known as immunoprivilege?
Mm.
So these are things that kind of like spark my curiosity as well. Also, just looking outside of just hair loss for a second, it seems like in other conditions, when you have excess lipid production in the human body, it leads to fibrosis. Atherosclerosis being, one of those primary issues when you have high cholesterol, right? Um,
Yeah.
I wouldn't see why that, again, going back to a hair loss condition, why lipids aren't widely discussed, right? Um, for people that have lichen planopilaris, I even talked to someone in my Discord server who just got diagnosed recently because finasteride wasn't working and dutasteride wasn't working, and they were still getting, hair loss. They went and got a biopsy, and it's like, oh wait, you don't have AGA. It looks like you may also have lichen planopilaris, and you have the histological features for it. When I look at the research for LPP, lichen planopilaris, there's too much of a focus on JAK inhibitors. It's like you're trying to modulate the secondary issue, which would be the lymphocytes and how they're responding to something, rather than responding and treating the something that these lymphocytes are attacking, which emerging evidence seems to be the downregulation of PPAR gamma. It seems like the pharmaceutical companies are looking at just developing new drugs rather than trying to visit older drugs, orphan drugs that could possibly be a solution, which would be these PPAR gamma agonists, which were primarily used for type 2 diabetes.
I think you're pointing out a tremendous blind spot, that exists, if it's not being studied adequately, for males, in this area. And as you mentioned, with regards to, people that are being screened for treatment or especially for a hair transplant, if this is missed, that is just, it's horrendous. It's, beyond medical mal medical malpractice. It's just malpractice on, the industry, as a whole, to look at it, at a deeper level. I mean, my personal experience was, and I think I mentioned it in the first interview, is that I had a lot of acne. I was definitely, in that cohort of patient that was dealing with that, was on Accutane and antibiotics, and all of that, that was so strong. And you know, not just in terms of DHT, but the impact of the sebaceous gland, within, you know, the environment, for my hair, you know, what was I contending with that might have been an amplifying factor, DHT being the primary, but in terms of the environment that it created, with it being so strong, for the onset, and we see this with other individuals as well, that it's just like wham, it hits you all at once. And it's not that it did hit me all at once. I mean, we know that people will lose up to 50% of their hair before they even notice that anything's gone. But that probably would have been me from age 12 on, while I was dealing with acne all the way up until when I started treatment at age 19, several years, where I went from mop top to the haircut that I had, and then all of a sudden, whoa, this is right on me. So I totally see where there are potentially other factors, aggravating factors, amplifying factors, that can be done. I think the joke within dermatology is that something's bothering your skin, put on some hydrocortisone cream. Use use prednisone. Get on oral prednisone if you've got an MS flare up, if you've got lupus, or if you're dealing with boom, that's the first line of defense. And again, that's dealing with things from a symptomatic standpoint.
Exactly.
It's not getting to the deeper level of things, and really parsing LPP out, and the underlying mechanisms. And diagnostically, you're right. People are not, guys are probably not being worked up with scalp biopsies, to truly differentiate, what's at hand. That's, probably an entire area that, that needs consideration.
It's a huge blind spot too, because it also leaves out women who aren't postmenopausal. Women who just may not be menopausal at all, right? Like it just creates I think a really poor narrative on who actually gets this condition. Especially when I was reading, I think Dr. Truab had this one article about lichen planopilaris being in a pattern similar in some sort of similar pattern to androgenetic alopecia, like presenting as pattern androgenetic alopecia. I thought that was horrific, because it's like, okay, there's probably some people walking around here with LPP that looks like AGA, and when you go to a dermatologist, again, they're not going to do a biopsy. At most, they'll just spread your hair apart, look around, and see what's going on, and then they'll be like, oh, okay, you have AGA. But in the event that someone doesn't have AGA and has LPP, or doesn't only have AGA, again, like you mentioned, acne, that involves microbes. Someone can have folliculitis as well. I went on the folliculitis subreddit, and I was kind of disturbed to an extent, because some people just didn't know what was going on, right? Yet they were getting persistent hair loss. Doctors are like, oh, well, you had a folliculitis flare up, but we can do PRP. Just it's as if I don't think people are being heard out when it comes to specific conditions, right? And I find that to be kind of disturbing. But at least going back to the point about DHT and lipid production, I also wonder, like, when we see, and I think Hair Cafe made a point on this, when we see DHT being involved with, cardiovascular diseases as well, that's interesting to me, right? If you have a defective, or if you have this sort of androgen that seems to upregulate lipid production in certain tissues, and I'm only looking at this from like sebaceous glands, right? I haven't looked at it deep enough to know if it's upregulating lipid production in other tissues throughout the body. But if that is the case, then it certainly, if somebody has AGA and, other signs of like high lipid production or, toxic lipid production that leads to severe acne, that could mark this person as someone who's susceptible to other, I guess, immediately harmful conditions, right? Cardiovascular disease being one of those. So, just huge oversight by the industry, in my opinion. Just very big oversight.
Yeah, I think it, you know, the big aspect of cholesterol, I think Peter Attia covers some of this, is the ApoB lipoprotein
Yeah.
and how that's expressed. I'd be very curious if somebody did, a population study that, looked at, the use of statins, but also looked at the use of hair loss medications and just see whether or not there's a higher incidence. If you just saw that at a population level, that might start speaking to, hey, what's at hand here. And again, just see where that leads you, and then work your way back from there. I think that somebody's probably written on it, but really going after that, from that standpoint, might speak to the point that you're having. I have high cholesterol. I've been on Avidart for 20 plus years. That happened. Increased high cholesterol happened despite use of Avidart. It would have been great if I could have averted
Yeah.
hypertension and higher lipids. So I'm not a good use case that way, but it certainly makes me curious with regards to my own personal presentation with things as to how my the expression of genes and so forth has played out in my case. And looking at it at a population level and then delving into the underlying mechanisms and so forth, I'm right there with you. I'm quite curious as to how that might have broader impacts. And again, I think we both know Kevin has covered a number of the ways in which DHT is a trash hormone, and
Yeah.
I think he's onto something there in terms of it. It seems like they're looking for uh, you know some people are looking into certain ways that 5-alpha reductase inhibitors might be helpful in other regards. And hey, maybe there's second life in a number of ways in which it can be utilized. Yeah, it's not going to cure all for for everything, but it might be helpful in other ways, and get a little bit deeper into this, as to what the connection might be.
Just to circle back on an earlier point you mentioned about when I think you also mentioned in our previous discussion too, that when you were younger, you had a lot of acne, like you were, you were an acne sufferer. Did you also have to deal with seborrheic dermatitis? Because there are people who talk about having an itchiness and an oily scalp, and in those particular areas where they're itching, right, they have the AGA present. So I was wondering if you ever had to deal with those sort of issues as well.
Yeah, I felt like using Rogaine only made the scalp itch that I had worse. It was definitely a pre-existing thing that was present throughout the period of when I had acne. And I think, having been on retinoids, topical as well as Accutane, it probably helped to mitigate some of that. Where, I started on Rogaine, I think I was pretty much done with Accutane, and therefore, applying, the Rogaine to my scalp was irritating things. Going to the hair loss clinic and using some of their treatments for the seborrheic dermatitis and to get the scalp itch down, it calmed things down. And I am absolutely certain that the quote unquote, when we talked about shedding much earlier, that was kind of mitigated, was in part because I was getting better penetration. The other part is things were just not as inflamed. Whether that was the laser or whether or not that was some of the other, scrubs that, they had as a part of things, to just kind of settle the scalp down. It was not any form of prednisone. That much I'm certain of. That was not included. But seborrheic dermatitis was absolutely, absolutely part of it. And I tend to think it was really amplified, by use of again the Rogaine and dealing with that. So that's part of it to me is when I started to be able to push back. And again, it's not like there was any dramatic regrowth at that period of time, but just better stabilization. And I feel like had I not had good stabilization then, I wouldn't be in the place that I am now where I can say, hey, I tried some different things out over the last year and I think it's helped me. Tell me what you think, people. I would have been on a different trajectory in terms of the acceleration of the onset. And even if those things, you know, whatever I was utilizing then, whether it's the laser or otherwise, even if it just helps to settle, the normalcy, maybe it gives you a better fighting chance. Maybe it's not increasing number of hairs per square inch, but maybe it's up-regulating nitric oxide. Maybe it's, I know you and I have talked about this, the erector pili muscle and the fatty infiltration that goes on.
Yeah.
Nitric oxide is one of the things that's in Dr. Proctor's product. You and I have come across research articles that talks about that, being a molecule that can reduce fatty infiltration. It's not outrageous to think that, hey, that's helpful because we want to have that connection to the hair cell. Because without it, it's awfully hard to get the hair kicked back in, as a part of it. So these ancillary treatments, I think, might have a role, outside of the conventional, hair count, hair density. It's just, nobody's looking at it that in depth and with that degree of detail. But from my personal experience, that's where I felt like, that stuff helped me. And I haven't had to deal with any kind of scalp itch or otherwise. And, I've utilized the laser in one form or another. It's probably been a combination of being on a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, for this period of time, but also some of those other things were a part of my stack before, Propecia came out and before that was available. So, it's probably plays a role in a positive one.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you on that. What I thought to be interesting in the beginning, you mentioned your use of Accutane, and I'm trying to link this back to PPAR gamma. Um, PPAR gamma receptors, they work with the retinoid receptor to actually, from what I remember, to actually go into the nucleus and then from there, causing upregulation of certain gene pathways. Um, so I could see how, when it comes to just like treating lipid production, you using that Accutane, that isotretinoin, getting a sort of stimulation in that sort of regard and reducing your oil glands, the output of sebum, how it, possibly could have, maybe somehow it could have contributed to helping your hair loss not get as bad as it could have been. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm just spitballing there.
Yeah, I've thought the opposite as well. I'd be really interested in looking at population data that looks at, the onset of somebody using something like Accutane or the other, topical retinoids. In particular Accutane though, and seeing from date where they started that, when's the date that they started Propecia?
Yeah.
Like I I would love to see the incidence and frequency, and I'd like to see, just the duration and the time frame between each of those. And is it a predictive, indicator for better or for worse? Maybe people that are using that earlier have a later onset of using Propecia. Oh, in which case, maybe that might get people thinking that it was helpful. You know, um, you know, above and beyond, what you and I talked about with sulfotransferase and that potentially being a confounding variable in all of that. But yeah, I feel like it was certainly helpful to my skin, and I think that was the point that the physician was making on the Huberman podcast yesterday, is that these medications are underappreciated in terms of the health benefit to the skin that they have. So I would tend to think it would have been a net positive, but I always, just because again, we talked about what an intense period of time it was. Did this cause a catastrophizing? Thinking about that sort of thing. Almost certainly not. Probably helped me overall, with it. But it's a point of curiosity looking at it, how that factors.
Regarding to your point about trying to gather that data, with electronic medical records and electronic health record, I think there maybe if there's a researcher listening right now, there is a way to actually synthesize that data very, and I guess in a somewhat retrospective manner. But nevertheless, I think it would be useful to see what you said. When did they start Accutane, and when did they start Propecia, or I guess Avidar, finasteride or Dutasteride, to try to see if there's any sort of correlation there. To me, I would think also looking at other sort of dermatological issues like the acne and seborrheic dermatitis, because I think I don't have the clearest of pictures, but I think there's just something going on there with, again, lipid metabolization as well as lipid metabolism as well as androgen. Just something going on there, and then maybe to the other point, microbe as well.
I do think it would be great if you got the opportunity to interview Dr. Proctor. He'd be a fascinating person to talk to and kind of raise some of these questions with, just with his background, clinical pharmacologist, physician, PhD, toxicologist, just really interesting insights to see, in particular on hair loss, but posing some of these questions. Something tells me his mind is, gone to these different places, and yeah, might have some interesting reflections all around.
Yeah, I mean, if you have like his contact or anything, I'm looking at his website. I definitely will reach out to him, because that's I'm just scrolling through his website right now. I'm scrolling through it, and yeah, I'm seeing the nitric oxide. I'm seeing a lot of scientific papers that are very neatly fitting into what we're talking about right now. So it's definitely something that's interesting.
Yeah, what's interesting on the main page, I think there, and Brian Shelton had shared me this. Brian never, I don't think he used Propecia. And I'm not even sure if he used Rogaine. I'm not sure whether or not he did, and he just had utilized Dr. Proctor's products. And if you look at, the first two photos that come up there, I think it's on the main page. That's photos of him and the results that he indicated that he had gotten, you know, from him. And I was like, really? I'm like, why aren't you going to use the other treatments? Again, I could be wrong on the minoxidil front. Um, but Propecia, he's like, yeah, I don't have any interest. I don't think it'll do that much for me. And again, based on his age and presentation, probably didn't feel, based on what we covered last time, that it would be of any benefit, and he was much more interested in stimulants and that sort of thing. But that was one anecdotal case. But I think I think it speaks to some of this. Some of his products are likely addressing certain components or aspects that these other products just won't, or otherwise.
Yeah, and it goes to the point of having like a hair stack of sorts, right? Just to address, I guess it can kind of be a headache keeping track of all these sort of aspects of what could be making someone's AGA worse, or just aggravating it in general. Um, but it goes to the point of actually trying to come up with a proper stack to address other issues outside of
Yeah,
androgens.
absolutely. It can, these other things can't entirely be discounted. To me, there's you've got your mainstays that absolutely have to be there and are your prime movers, and then are there other things that will help facilitate, or not just facilitate, but get other things just out of the way. Just make the normalized process that much easier for your body. And some of what I think he's gotten into and studied, and other folks are incorporating and utilizing with peptides or otherwise, is trying to work at that and going at it from from angles above and beyond. Again, you've covered in some other interviews from some fairly elaborate stacks. I can't see doing much, if any more, than what I'm doing, as a part of things, unless something was super compelling. But you do get to the point of not knowing, what is helping me and what is just, something that, I think is helping me, but is really just there for not a good reason. I think Dr. Proctor would talk about this. Maybe it's on the website or otherwise, but he talked about before there was a time of double-blind, randomized, controlled trials. That there was the crossover study design, and that was the idea that you took a number of individuals and half of them got what you thought was the active ingredient and the other half didn't. They got some other component, and then you cross them over into the active component at a later time, and then you tried to sort out from those individuals whether or not the active ingredient had its role as part of things. And so you built up somewhat anecdotal evidence. That's the way clinical studies were done. That's the way information, initial research was done before we could really get to the modern age that we're in now, to really differentiate what is a placebo effect versus what is the true active ingredient. But he talked about that a lot, and I think that's where he's, if I remember back to some of his posts, again, maybe it's on his website, where he's continued to try and refine what's in his formula, as a part of things, that he can address different components because he's not going about it the pharmaceutical route, but also trying to update things because over a given period of time, individuals might wind up needing something or benefiting, as they go along and within the process, and trying to cover that.
Most certainly, I would definitely agree with you on that. Yeah. Um, let's see. I'm trying to if there are any other questions from the comment section, because I think we kind of captured a lot of them in the beginning. I guess I'll just go to my Discord server because some people, it seems as if they have some questions there. Let me just pull them up real quick. See.
Sure.
So, all right, I'm just gonna read them off one by one. Wait, I think actually we already answered this one. Okay. Okay, so somebody asked this question. Have you ever taken time off of Dutasteride and perhaps noticed an improvement in mood or cognitive abilities?
I don't think that there's been more than other than maybe a week where my prescription didn't get filled, that I've been off of it, and that's been true since I started finasteride when it came out. I've been on a 5-AR inhibitor since pretty much the outset, and not off for a week. I mean, other life events have come up that have more impacted my mood than than what I think is the medications. But no, there never been a time where I've been off them for for any period of time based on illness or otherwise. It's just been sitting there in my pillbox.
The next question would be, and I think we probably already touched on this earlier, but Honda Boy asks, apart from the hair growth, does it seem to you that the dutasteride had any effect on your aging, and do people perceive you as younger because of it?
Yeah, I would definitely say so. I mean, I've been kind of in a health kick, health renaissance the last few years. And I would say that I definitely look a younger, early 50s. Um, if you were to look at, my two siblings, my brothers that are right about my same age, you would say, yeah, these guys look older, you know, compared to myself. Um, I definitely, you know, um, have only started. I think I mentioned earlier in the interview doing Botox. Again, you can look at some of the photos, that are a part of, previously, and even the ones that I've provided you, where I can see the wrinkles across my forehead. Those are gone, because I did Botox 6 weeks ago. It'll last another 6 weeks, and that has really, I think, taken a degree of time off. Um, Somebody might perceive me as being in my 40s, though. I don't think that I'm getting away with, other than when you see me in a photo and I've got a big smile and my face is kind of naturally lifted, you would see a little bit of
I'll
it
just say
there.
this.
But
I'll speak. I'll just speak to the photo that I saw that you sent me. You look like you're in your like 30s, like early 30s. That was super impressive. I'm not gonna lie. I was like, wow. That was my jaw dropped. I was like, that's crazy.
well, if I'm ever in your neighborhood, we're gonna put that to the test. Does that photo hold up in person? Yeah, no, I definitely think that, all the different things that I've done, to put hair loss aside, sauna, red light, using tretinoin, you know, Botox most recently, doing the peptides. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that has, reinvigorated a more youthful look and general glow, and paying attention to, I lost, close to 40 pounds in the last, few years, got myself built back up. In terms of musculature, it definitely, people have remarked on that. And I know you and I covered the topic with regards to guys and dating and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I had updated excuse me, I had updated my profile photo, on social media. And, one of the things that came up, and this is true in person, and again, no, this is not a slight against men that like other men, but 95% of the guys that give me compliments, whether at the gym or looking good, man, how old are you? That sort of thing. Profile photo, it's like 95% guys. like,
It happens,
well,
yeah.
I'm really trying to get in shape and look good for the opposite sex. I mean, that's my preference. but it's not coming in that way. So women that I'm friends with, I sent them like screenshots. I go, "Can you believe this?" I go, "You got to get in the comment section here." I go, "This is not working out as planned." And we just, had a good laugh, to ourselves, about that. But yeah, definitely. If I sent you a photo of myself and, my brothers, you'd be like, yeah, yeah, Brendan's, probably holding up a little better. And I think that the AGA, again, I was the first one for that to hit. And what you see with my brothers is that's, kind of progressed beyond where I am. But you would see all these other aspects of health and so forth have helped me maintain a bit more of a youthful appearance.
Yeah, definitely. That leads into the next question that somebody asked. I'll just read it as it's written. Again, I think you already did cover a part of this message, but kind of goes into your last point. Uh, Someone asks the question, how has being on Dutasteride for 20 plus years impacted your self-image and mental well-being related to hair loss? And have there been any sort of shifts in how other people, as well as yourself, image has been
I mean, I
perceived?
I think, when I think about the initial the initial onset of hair loss, there's me, I've got 10 close high school friends. We all got together last September. When I think about when we get together, and I was leaving high school 30 years ago and in college, and everybody was back that first couple of years from being away. Me and a couple other guys, we were getting reamed out for, I mean, just busting balls, for having losing her hair. And one of the other guys who had a very aggressive loss is completely bald now. He was in town, just a couple weeks ago here locally, and I know that that impacted him heavily, and I was feeling it, during that period of time, and my self-esteem and otherwise, and the lack of control over that, and just not having a lot of treatment options or something that I knew would truly arrest it, was the biggest negative at that phase or period of time, in my life. Being on 5-alpha reductase inhibitor, Avodart, for the last 20 years, has given me a degree of control over things that I know that I'm doing the very best that I can. And I feel very, very blessed to have had that. But there's not been a day that's gone by just based on having a stack and having the routine that you go through with applying something to your body that you're hoping has a positive cosmetic impact, that you don't think about it or have a degree of eroticism with regards to. At the same time, as I've matured, as years have gone by, you develop, a more honest self-reflection with regards to that, and positive self-image because of it. And, getting some later in life success with regards to where I'm at, it has made me that much more happy that I didn't throw in the towel at an earlier time. But it's absolutely, when I think back to that period of time in my early 20s, that onset, when I think about, some of the intersexual dynamics and relationships that I was in, it made me a lot more anxious, maybe a bit more jump the gun to want to get commitment from someone because I felt like part of my youth was fading. And that made an imprint on myself. And so we've reflected on, things, in the previous interview, where maybe I didn't need to, because there were other factors and variables that I could have been working on that were that much more important as a part of things. But for me, it really, really took hold. So it has definitely been an overall, challenge to my character, but it's also driven me, kind of down the path of self-improvement. Because without that level or degree of challenge, maybe academically, I would not have pursued academically, professionally, the level or degree of success I've had in other areas of my life. If someone like Jeff Bezos had let his hair loss get to him and just wallowed in a corporate job, he wouldn't have done Amazon. Who knows? You may never get the answer, from him directly. Maybe it was never a variable. But when you look at interviews of when he started the company, yeah, he was well into losing his hair. He was probably a very driven guy that would have done it one way or the other. But I wonder about things like that, and I know it's had an impact. Overall, it's been challenging, but it's made me more of who I am, which I'm very happy with at this phase of my
Wow,
life.
that was very well put. I think for many people dealing with their hair loss issues, whether they choose to, they choose about taking some sort of a pharmacological intervention. I don't want to sound corny or anything, but it kind of like in the process of dealing with such an issue, you kind of learn a lot about yourself, right? And I think it's very invaluable, right? To learn how to overcome something like hair loss or just try to manage it, uh, because I feel like it becomes a very, I don't know, just core experience to someone's development, going through something like that.
Absolutely. I feel like the acne was significant. I got ribbed about that all the way from grade school through high school. I can remember what the kids' names were, during that period of time. I know which one of my friends was really busting my balls about my hair and otherwise. So, it developed my character and personality, certainly in a certain way. It's not as though if I had kept a full head of hair or perfect skin during that period of time, that people would have had other things to bust my balls about. They certainly would have, absolutely. So it's not like it would have, insulated me from that. But it's two aspects to things that I took really, really personal and probably impacted me in terms of, fitness and weight loss or weight gain at different periods of time, and impacted my self-esteem. Um, but being on the medications, having them, has given me a degree of control. And I do really well with protocols, and really well with routine. And I've recognized that maybe I was already good with it, maybe it's helped to really refine that skill, but that's something that can benefit you in life, as you go forward. you know just having set routines, things that you just go through, that you get done, that you're on to the more important things for your day.
So do you see any sort of like major changes to your stack coming up soon, or is it, pretty much is this going to be it
I
for
think
the
that this will
foreseeable
be it for the
future?
foreseeable future. I will certainly contemplate going back on and reconsidering doing, the growth hormone peptides again, probably later on in the fall or winter. Um, for that sort of thing. I kind of want to see how things play out for myself in terms of, the benefit that I've gotten, and whether or not that holds up. At the same time, I don't want to let go of what I feel like is the potential benefit as well. So, something like BPC, which I think that there's really, of any of the peptides, you know, the greatest degree of a potential positive benefit to your overall health, and less of the risk, is probably something I would rotate onto, not just seasonally or intermittently, but more regularly. So other than that, I think everything is pretty much going to stay the same. Again, I think we talked about, Avidart and maybe considering a higher dose of that.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think my primary would prescribe it, so I might have to get a secondary source if I was to do that. Um, but no, other than that, pretty much everything I'm going to stay on right on track with.
Sorry, I'm just scrolling through. Like a lot of these questions are just pretty much things you've already answered before. Yeah, somebody asking for advice for younger men. Again, I think you already covered that last time, actually. Um, hmm. Oh, skincare
Take
routine.
another crack.
Sorry, what happened?
I'll take another crack at it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so the advice you would have for, again, someone, the younger version of you, right? Especially with the ample amounts of scientific research that we have today that's even more readily accessible than it was back, during your time. What's some advice you could give to someone on where to start? Because there's so many different stacks and things to consider. We were just talking about, lipids earlier in this, podcast. Um, so I can understand why somebody who is losing their hair, just looking for a place to just start. What's some advice you can give to them? Like what would, maybe not directly to them, right? But what's some advice you would give to your younger self, right? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, as a joke, I said to myself, if I knew that ProScar was available in 1992, I would have started working as a pharmacy tech. I would have tried to shuttle some of the bottles. That's what I would have told a younger self. Hey, man, it's already available. Just go in there and rip off CVS. It's terrible advice. Terrible advice. But no, just recognize that you're in it for the long haul, and it gets started with the basics and the stuff that you and I have covered and talked about in terms of sulfotransferase and otherwise, and that overall skin health and optimizing what you can do, um, is going to set you up, to really make the best decision going forward. Don't listen to a lot of the noise that's out there. Go to the most reliable sources. I think, Kyle, your channel here and what you're offering is just good, solid, information. It's easy to get caught up in all the hype. I think I alluded to it in our previous conversation that I was hopeful. I was, so surprised over the last 30 years there haven't been more options that have come out. But that doesn't mean that you can't find things that effectively work for you. And developing protocols, routines for yourself, that you can stick to, that this is really an extension of your overall health and well-being, and personal appearance is important. And it shouldn't be important in the sense that you're beating yourself up over it, but that you're really trying to optimize who and what you are. You hear a lot of the chatter in these these different groups that are out there talking about male self-improvement, um, alphas versus beta males, one group of men versus another. What you're really trying to do is become the alpha version, the best version of yourself. And if this is a part of that, and that helps you build and work on other things, because this is not something you're going to have to worry about as much, then fantastic. Absolutely awesome. Make that something that you're committed to, and recognize that that's really the person that you're working with. That's the only person you've got to really answer to from day to day. And just try and get out in front of this situation, because there are some other positive things on the way. People that are getting involved in this now are going to be really lucky over the next 10-15 years if they hold their ground where they're at. I can see a lot of good things going forward. That's my best advice.
Yeah, that was very well put, actually. Especially about hope for future treatments, right? I think they always say what 5 years. That's kind of like the meme. Oh, it's 5 years away the cure, but I certainly think just more effective treatments, whether it's hair cloning, whether it's just regeneration, hair follicle regeneration, and these new growth stimulants. I think we're solving enough that at any moment, it really realistically, it could be something that's in the pipeline right now, that's being studied right now. We can get a more effective treatment or growth stimulant somewhere in the near future. So yeah, it's a very encouraging message as well, especially just to recognize that, okay, yeah, competition exists, right? It exists out here in many ways, but also just trying to improve yourself. At the end of the day, that's really what you have the most control over, right? Is yourself, as best as you can in your environment, trying to improve yourself. And it's definitely, I think, at least in this day and age, you have a lot of people that follow the whole I think they call it the black pill philosophy, where they just have this abhorrent nihilistic view on life. And I can understand. There's someone on my server, he says that hair loss makes people go crazy, right? And I think that certainly is true, especially when there's this one study that said that people that experience hair loss have a higher incident of like body dysmorphia compared to other people with dermatological conditions. And it's like, Well, that's other people with dermatological conditions. I think the study said 10 times, right? So imagine compared to the general
Yes.
population, what that might be, the comparison might be. So, yeah, certainly I think it's, people just have to return to center and kind of, I don't know, just recognize that, okay, at the end of the day, you're just trying to do the best that you can to address your condition. So, yeah, your message really, I hope people actually listen to it, right? And can take action.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough. Everybody's going to have their own path to take to get there, to wrap their head around that. But once you've arrived there, you're in a much stronger place, because it can come across as very generic information. Um, you know, what is it? JBY, just be yourself. Well, I don't like myself, so what kind of advice
Yeah.
is that? It's be the best version of yourself. Look to people that have the success and attributes that you want, and you know emulate that, not imitate that, and try and follow their path that got them there. Recognize where your shortcomings are by doing a honest self-assessment without the self-indictment. That's the biggest thing to decouple, you know for for somebody that's in this circumstance and in this space. And if you can do that, then you know a lot of things get easier, and managing this doesn't become a daily scrutiny on yourself, and you know uh negative self-assessment as to how things have gone in your life.
Oh, certainly agree. Yeah, it's that point that it's like, oh, you have to love yourself, right? Like you said. Usually when people say love yourself, it's love yourself, don't take action. Don't do what you're about to do, but what you're about to do, love yourself. It's like, yeah, you have to love yourself enough to make a change, right? That's why many people do the things they do. They want to have a better life. They want to and I could see in some instances it getting a bit toxic, right? But I think we have to, keep things in perspective. Many times the changes that people are trying to make are something that's going to, at least in my opinion, when it comes to aesthetics, improve their quality of life to some degree, right? Of course, people can go above and beyond and they start to do, wacky things. Um, but also, it's about recognizing that you have to, if you want to do something, if you want to make a positive improvement on your life, you will have to change, aspects about how you're approaching life, right? Maybe not necessarily yourself, maybe along the way when you approach changing those aspects, you start to change your personality as well, or some aspect of yourself as well. But yeah, you love yourself enough to make the change. So I guess that's just my message. This I'm probably going to put into the middle of the podcast because it just came into my mind. Uh, I think we were talking about neuropeptides before, or something along the lines of the erector pili muscle. Um,
Yeah.
I just think it's ridiculous that we don't have any sort of direct targeted therapies that's widespread that specifically targets the erector pili muscle. There's a guy, I'm not sure if you've seen him before on Reddit or any other places, but I remember when I brought him up, you mentioned that there was some guy on the old forums where he used to talk about how you'd want to pluck your body hair so DHT could like get to your scalp or something like that. I don't fully
Our,
remember. Yeah.
our boy Ernie.
Yeah, yeah. So
Shout out to Ernie. The
yeah, shout
Ernie.
out to Ernie. We have I guess we have someone I guess who's similar in that sort of ethos. His name is Magic Bold. And I've spoken to him many times, and uh although he talks about how working out your calf muscles can stimulate your erector pili muscle, and being in cold water and just cold showers can make the erector pili muscles kind of work, right? And kind of like working them out and strengthening that connection to the stem cell bulge. I'm not entirely sure about the mechanism of action of doing calf workouts to do that. He mentioned that there was a specific growth factor. I think he said it's TGF 25 or something like that, that stimulates the erector pili muscle, but this growth factor is only released when you do like large working out large muscle groups, essentially. Um, I guess the point is, at least to my amazement, why aren't pharmaceutical companies like adequately looking at neuropeptides to stimulate the erector pili muscle? I feel like pharmaceutical companies tend to just overlook large spaces of dermatological structures that are valuable to hair growth, and they just solely focus on enzymatic processes rather than just maybe a few enzymatic processes, but whether it's 5-alpha reductase or I don't know, maybe something to do with, I guess now PPAR gamma, but to a lesser degree. I just wish they just looked at the functional aspects of the hair follicle. Like, okay, what is happening to this particular tissue? What is happening to this particular substructure? And maybe targeting that substructure in such a way that could find another route to, ameliorating androgenetic alopecia and other forms of hair loss.
Yeah, I know. I think it's it's definitely the sort of area, you know, just based on I think our previous conversations, with regards to where's the dividing line between hair that can be brought back online or hair that's going to just stay dormant, despite any of the advances with stimulants. And nitric oxide, that I'm going to forward you a study that uh, talks about this sort of thing. Nitric oxide was one of the molecules that worked in that regard. I don't remember neuropeptide or otherwise, but I think that's you know some of some of what uh, Dr. Proctor's work is after. It's likely trying to prevent that cell death and in some ways maintain that connection. That's my gut instinct and feeling, is that it's got some level of not turning the skin or the tissue or the hair follicle into looking like organ rejection, whether that's in just improving the overall state of the skin or reducing any aspect of scarring. But to me, that would be a fantastic you know uh, molecule to incorporate. His shampoo does include nitric oxide, and I think the study that I sent you here uh, covers, I think, some of what they had developed, which was a nitric oxide, hyaluronic acid, and I think minoxidil, delivered as a multimodal, treatment. I'm gonna see. Don't see anything with regards to rector pilate in here, but I know it was in a separate study that I think was looking at skeletal muscle, that it reduced the fatty infiltration that can go on with muscles that are atrophied. And if again the rector pilate muscle is disconnected from the hair follicle, then it's gonna atrophy. And if any of that can be mitigated, then you've got a decent chance of bringing the hair cycle and the hair process really back online. But yeah, I'm not familiar with anything that works on that directly. My, kind of my assumption based on, maybe why some people get some degree of benefit or some don't from red light therapy, is that it might have some role there. Again, that'd be the sort of thing that would have to be studied and looked at. But again, it sits in, kind of sits in that space where you're trying to get just a more effective and efficient, cellular turnover, and that connection to me would be an end result of that. Yeah, you need, if even before anything else came out other than anti-androgen, if you just had something that maintained that connection, that would be easier to jumpstart that process because that connection is still in place. Somebody would be so much better off, having that. And, but I don't think anything's been looked at directly for it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I would describe it as so. Yeah, very unfortunate. I think that's pretty much the end of the podcast. There's any sort of final words you'd like to say to the audience? You're
Yeah,
welcome to say it.
I don't have anything beyond what we shared, just beyond the self-improvement, um, positive talk that I shared before. I think that there's, there are really good resources that are out there for people if they are struggling with this sort of thing. Recognize that, there's a lot that goes into the perception of others, the opposite sex, if that's your preference, and really master making over your style and optimizing. You're looking a number of different ways if that's where you want to start with things. Sometimes that's a great place to start for people. Whether that's with their wardrobe, their style, finding something that really works for them, in terms of their overall presentation. But don't let, any of what goes on with hair loss get in your way of your professional goals and pursuits accordingly, because that's the sort of thing that'll benefit you long term. Just pursue good resources that are out there, and the positive voices that'll come with that, because on YouTube for free, as you can see with all, of what's offered that's out there, there's some really good information. Just recognize that you've got to kind of wade your way through that. But this is something that, you can endure and get beyond and do perfectly well with. And I hope that everybody benefits, from this. Think about where I started in the early 1990s battling this, and it's become a part of, what I've had to work through. But there's still, margin and room for improvement and refinement. And just think about that. It's self optimization is what you're working on.
Definitely. Well, with that being said, I want to thank John for just coming back and doing this follow up and answering some of your questions in the audience, along with us, talking about some other interesting things to do with hair loss and just other conditions as well. So I want to thank you, John, for coming back. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. Anytime.